We're gonna stay down under for our third presentation from Alan O'Connor, um, looking at how entrepreneurial maybe some of these ecosystems actually are. So over to you, Alan.
Thank you for that. So I think this paper kind of locks in quite nicely with what the other two, particularly Martin sort of setting the scene with kind of different ontological and epistemological questions. And then Martin, the second Martin number two, highlighting that kind of connection between that macro and micro environments in terms of the people and the context within which they sit. And I think some of the discussion that was where it was landing off or trailing off in that last session was really heading into where this question is or where is the entrepreneurial and the ecosystem? And that raises the question of, do you need a population of entrepreneurs or do you need a mix? And I guess that's where this paper is going to go, and really looking at the question of balance in socioeconomic communities. To give you a little bit of context, I want to just touch on why this work, why I've actually ventured into this. And I want to go into a bit of a theoretical background, sort of bringing an economic theory or lens to it for a moment. I don't want to dwell on it because you're probably well aware of it, but it is an important piece to actually get the context of the next thing, which is really when you look at the ecological model of an ecosystem and how that actually plays out, and how we may be able to use this to really identify some aspects of the ecosystem work. Of course, it brings to some implications and discussion I'd welcome at the end. So why this work? Around 2013, really, Adelaide, down under, not New South Wales and not Queensland, but Adelaide, a different state. A much smaller city in terms of where Martin is, and both Martins are to some extent. There is a pretty tight-knit community. In a way, it's a more regional city, still a capital city for the state, but it's a more regional city. And there was a lot of discussion around trying to get entrepreneurship going. And this book by Huang and Horowitz about rainforest and Silicon Valley was floating around, and it was very much the topic of discussion, and there were workshops running and all kinds of things to try and understand the ecosystem. And the government was in all of this and going, well, what is it that we should do, which led to some other work. But before I get to that, the thing that really, and you probably can't read that very well, but the thing that really struck me with that is we're talking about Silicon Valley as the secret sauce, if you like. And on the back cover, it talks about, can you make Silicon Valley, can we replicate that in other places? And the more I thought about that, and I think it was raised in today's discussion as well, they are different. Every place is different. So to just follow a recipe of how we make Silicon Valleys everywhere was not necessarily the answer. So that was kind of the prompt for me to get into this whole area of entrepreneurial ecosystems, and mostly because policy makers were facing a choice of, well, if that's the answer, but we don't have the ingredients for it, how do we get there? And given the notion that Martin too just put to this about histories, we have different geographies, we have different cultures, we have different histories, and that all makes a difference to the way the ecosystem plays out. So that led right back in 2014, a study on basically Adelaide, and sort of thinking about the entrepreneurial ecosystem there, and really talking to the entrepreneurs and trying to understand what that is. And that has led to a series of editorial kind of work and writing work since then to actually try and develop this a bit more. The last one, which was with David Ordris, Colin Mason, and Morgan Miles, really focused on more the dynamics aspect. And in that, the editorial article, we focused on the time aspect and how that actually, how we could look at that differently and actually bring about different, or understand the ecosystem in different ways, depending on which time frame we're looking at. So that really highlights the fact we're not only there's a geographical element here, there's also the temporal element of ecosystems, which we want to think about. So out of all that, it kind of led me to thinking, led me back to some of the earlier work before I started all this, and right back to my doctoral work in the first place, which was really thinking about some of the economic debates and how entrepreneurs actually play a role in economic development. So I just want to just briefly touch on this because it resonated really sharply with me the more I thought about it after this work around this time and the temporal dimension. So first of all, just sort of kicking off and acknowledging that there are authors before Schumpeter, of course, but you know, Schumpeter really brought into the notion of thinking about the disruptive behaviour of entrepreneurs, and in doing that, he established kind of a model in his 1934 or 1911 book in German. But in that book, he was talking around there is a static market or an economy which is a circular flow of activity, and he meant that in not necessarily a way that there was no activity within that static market, but he looked at it as rather a hermetic sense. That is, it was sealed and sort of not being interrupted by things outside of the marketplace. So he starts off from that point. And then he launches into the idea of the entrepreneur and really draws out the fact, well, the entrepreneur is a disequilibrating market mechanism in that hermetic state. So, and that kind of led to a series of debates, I guess, and this is just a couple I've pulled out. And you know, Herbert Link in 1982 started to really go through that economic history and really pull out what were key elements here. They found 4 types of entrepreneurship, if you like: pure uncertainty, pure innovation, uncertainty and ability, innovation kind of things, and perception adjustment. But I think the last point they really concluded on was the greatest homogeneity amongst those things, or where there was greatest agreement, was between type B and type B, type B and D rather, where B were the theorists were really about how the entrepreneur was really the disequilibrator, and type D theorists regarded the entrepreneur as the equilibrating mechanism. So in this economic debate, you kind of see there were 2 tranches of the way we could think about the entrepreneur. And that goes on a little bit more, and we've got Barreto in about 89, I think there was, and my screen is covered, but I think that's what it was. And Barreto started to talk about the functions, which is really interesting. So we've gone from characteristics to start talking about the functions of the entrepreneur within an economic setting. And again, Barreto identified 4, the coordination and the uncertainty bearing the top and bottom one is really about the function of the entrepreneur at a firm level. Whereas the middle ones, the arbitrage and the innovation, were again going to that market level and arguing basically that arbitrage and innovation served different functions. One was equilibrating and the other was disequilibrating. So with that kind of background, in about 1990, it gave way, and this is the article that kind of put this debate to one side for me at the time, was a sort of, well, actually one force gives way to another. They both exist, and there's an entrepreneur in both of those conditions, and those things actually, there is an interplay. So from there, that argument, or at least the way I've seen this argument, or haven't seen this argument since around the 1990s, and maybe that's just because I haven't been looking as well in this space. But it seems that idea of the entrepreneur being a disruptor or an equilibrator or a disequilibrator kind of subsided. And, you know, we got the opportunity focused, and we got a different kind of literature coming through, or the strength of that literature. But it wasn't until we revisited or were talking about the time dynamics that those ideas of those economic differences really started to resonate again. And I just want to now sort of switch to the emergence of the ecosystem viewpoint and sort of highlight some aspects and where these 2 things start to collide. So first of all, in the special issue that we did back in 2018, sorry, a book we're looking at in terms of regional aspects or place-based aspects in ecosystems. We were looking at the contributions of the literature and tried to synthesize that. And we made 2 points there. That first of all, the ecosystem is a steady state it was kind of apparent that the ecosystem was a steady state, natural, regulated system, maintaining balance among the organisms. In other words, it's an equilibrating kind of environment. It's balanced, but it is open to disruption from the external influence, and it might differ in its ability to absorb those external shocks, which brings you to the point about resilience. So if we think about those economic viewpoints and you say, we got the steady state there, how quickly we can return to that steady state after an external shock is the kind of thing that's happening in that statement. And in the statement B, if you like, there's an alternate view where the ecosystems are in a constant change that shifts between levels of complexity. In biological terms, it suggests that survival, active cooperation, and external factors each need to be accounted for in understanding the ecosystem development and change. So it's saying basically the opposite. It's not stable. It is constantly changing. It's in complex ways. So that kind of opened up the thought, well, okay, how do ecologists deal with this? And that's been kind of the way I've been thinking about ecosystems now for some time. How do they deal with this kind of different viewpoints and whatnot? So in that, there's some work done by Holling and Gunderson, who looked at human systems and natural systems and tried to understand, and their book is called Panarchy, and it really is a really worthwhile read, and if you haven't come across it, and looking at the way systems behave. And in that, they presented this kind of, I don't think they put it in the diagram, but they certainly spoke about this figure-8 kind of evolution or cycle that happens within an ecosystem. And they branded some of these things around with economic descriptors as well, which is what I've put in this diagram. So, and what they were talking about is the system. If you're looking at the ecosystem, that human ecosystem, you've got the conservative kind of top right-hand corner, which is the steady state. Everything's fine, it's hierarchically structured, and it's fairly steady state. What you get, though, is you get knowledge spillover which comes from those firms into the bottom left, and that's what gives seed to creative destruction. That creative destruction then zooms up to the top left-hand corner, where you get the innovation and the knowledge and the restructuring of ideas. Out of that restructuring of ideas then becomes the entrepreneurial market view, which takes them to market, bringing those back up to the right-hand corner, disrupting what's already there, and creating a new level of performance, if you like, in your economy. So they play with this kind of potential and connectedness relationship. And if I think back now to the economic arguments, you can see that right-hand side of this is really perhaps looking at the equilibrium part if we don't cross over to the left-hand side. And the left-hand side is really about the disequilibrating dynamics that are going on. So we've got these two halves, but what Holling and Gunderson's are stating is we can't look at them in two halves. The ecosystem has all of this, which gives you your temporal dynamics. So from there, we can just make, I just want to make a comment about the complexity and the emergence side of things, because the complexity sciences are also looking this is an article from Liechtenstein, is also looking at that emergence aspect of ecosystems. So how does this happen? And the claim here by Liechtenstein is entrepreneurship is the study of emergence, where these new things, new ideas, new technologies, new ventures, they all emerge through the dynamics of the ecosystem. But in some ways, this to me kind of neglects the question with what effect, and how does this how this emergence influences the system. So we can study the emergence, sure, but with what effect? So what? How does it actually change those systems? Also becomes part of the question. So the next point of this is that ecology then provides us a bit of a clue. So the more I went into the forest ecology literature, there is the way ecosystems are explained are through these three primary attributes: the composition, the function, and the structure. So you need to know what is there, what the things that are there do within the ecosystem, and lastly, how are they structured to do those things. So those three elements are primary attributes to understanding how an ecosystem works. Now, these are not easily pulled apart either, because some of your compositional elements then become part of function, and of course that function may be dependent on structure. So these things may be very, very closely intertwined. But through this, you also get these aspects of, in various ways, these composition, function, and structure combine to give you structural complexity and biodiversity. And by the way, coming back to the very opening of this, rainforests are the most structurally and biodiverse ecosystems in a forest sense. So they're the highest order, if you like, of structural complexity and biodiversity. So it kind of takes you back to that notion of, okay, so are we talking about then, if we're looking at ecosystems, that both that structural complexity and biodiversity, how does that relate then back to our human ecosystems, and acknowledging our very first comments from Martin One's presentation and the comment that Ben made was that the ecosystems, they're all there, they are all there, but they vary in the structural complexity and biodiversity. Same with our naturals, our entrepreneurial ecosystems and our industrial ecosystems, they vary. So that brings us to some things about, well, how do they vary? What changes are there? So, and again, some of that ecological work targets 4 types of changes. They first suggest there's the long-term change, and they quote climate change as one of those long-term effects. We don't see it in immediate terms, but it's gradually building up, and it's changing the ecosystem through those long-term associations. There's these allogenic changes, which are relatively more frequent. They're fires and floods and earthquakes, those kind of things, which are short, sharp shocks, and they come in, but they're not all the time. They're irregular. There's biogenic causes of change, whether that be plague or disease, and we have that right now. We have an epidemic or a pandemic around biological change, and you can see that change is actually affecting the behavior of our industries, etc. Then lastly is this fourth one is the autogenic change, which is the response to these things and those disturbances by the internal conditions. So for me, this starts to actually signal something around the entrepreneur here. So you've got these external or these kind of, external in the ecological sense, shocks that are imposed on the ecosystem. The autogenic responses inside are actually then changing your structure, function, and composition inside the ecosystem, which gives you your next tranche of what this ecosystem is. Then when you look at the ecosystem, you can see those marked changes. So the autogenic change is part of that ecological succession of how you actually see that. So a model of something like
time now, Alan. So we're just going.
Oh, am I? Sorry. Okay, I'll wrap up on that.
The questions anyway. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm just about there. So the model of that, you can put that into a model to actually see that, and to kind of explain or explore what that might mean in an entrepreneurial ecosystem sense. You can also overlay some of that, and the entrepreneurial drivers become your autogenic kind of characteristics that you're looking for, which influence your composition, structure, function, your structural complexity, and your social diversity, to actually understand what the whole is looking like. That's it. And so it's just a bit of an overview of some thoughts around how, and it may stitch some of those discussions we've already had together in some way.
Thank you very much, Alan. Yeah, that takes us back to some of the core literature around ecology and thinking there. Time for some questions and comments. Now we do have 5 minutes. I think we can all agree really that, we move beyond the idea of just thinking about the ingredients, and that's very limiting in a way, and going back to sort of Roma, thinking about recipes, and that recipes links to sort of ideas about composition, function, and structure. And within the notion of entrepreneurship, to me, it seems, there's mileage in thinking about the logics in a way as well. If we think about sort of maybe a framework around sort of maybe effectual logics and causal logics, seems to be, quite interesting. How could that fit in? And thinking about the second Martin's presentation in a way, are there different logics emerging due to differences in personalities? I don't know, which could then influence into some of these auto genetics in a way.
So just responding to that in some way, that the notion of diversity, that social diversity, can be in those kind of diversity of logics within a place. The richer the place is, which makes me wonder or question the idea of specialization in terms of a place. And if you think about that, if I think about Detroit in the States and that kind of Rust Belt area where it's very specialized in one area, it becomes very open to shock and change. So the entrepreneur has a role in actually building that diversity. So there's some of the questions that come about that. And if you need more diversity, maybe you need more entrepreneurial kind of behavior. But if you don't need more diversity, maybe you don't. So you want not necessarily more. So they're kind of questions that are raising in my mind, at least.
Alan, what would you say? Sorry, what would you say if you're very entrepreneurial and you're full of energy, but your ecosystem is not very entrepreneurial? What would you recommend? You find the entrepreneurial ecosystem, or you try to change your own ecosystem, whatever way? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think both of those things happen, right? And they're personal choices, and people stay in places because of things not only their own personal drivers. They might be family drivers. There might be the historic presence, all sorts of things that might influence that. But I know working in Adelaide, we see a lot of people head to the eastern seaboard because it's a stronger ecosystem, and that may be age dependent as well. So you've kind of got some variations there. So, but from a policymaker's perspective, what does that mean? It becomes the next question.
Couldn't you just work on a very small ecosystem and as a first stage, find these 10 people, so to speak, bring them all together, density, diversity, but a very small one, and then maybe grow this? Would that be otherwise they might get lost, so to speak, in that non-entrepreneurial ecosystem. I'm just wondering, from a practice perspective, action-oriented perspective, what can we do? What can the entrepreneurial people that have the energy actually do? Other than leaving?
Well, I guess the answer to that is depends on what is at hand, and that's why you need to understand the function, structure, and composition. And if you can think about what those things are, say, for instance, let's take the more obvious one, capital. If there is no capital in the place, that's the compositional element you need. So you need to be able to think about how do we bring that capital in to change the composition of the ecosystem, for instance. Now, whether that's the role of the entrepreneur, the entrepreneur may not be thinking about that. A policymaker may be.
So there are some stories that famous ecosystems started in a restaurant, or I think around MIT there's still this story and so on. With academics, they all met in one small place. So it's again a density story, very similar to what I presented, but just in a very small place. Would that be? And we have the hubs, right? And you have that in Adelaide, for example, that kind of hub approach. So what do you think about this local concentration of?
Well, I think that's part of your ecosystem. If you think about forest ecologies, what you would actually say is you need nesting places for different type of species. So what you're suggesting is by having a hub, you're creating a structural place for your people to come to actually be able to create more entrepreneurial activity. So it makes sense to do that.
Great. Thank you very much, Alan.